Welcome to the Catholic Leadership Network podcast, helping ministry leaders succeed from the beginning, with your co-hosts, Christy Cabanis and Sarah Jarzembowski. Started there. So hello, everyone. All right. Welcome to the Catholic Leadership Network podcast. We are here to support ministry leaders from the very beginning. We talk about all the things no one told you about working in the church. We hope you find a grounded place to meet colleagues and get encouragement. We are really glad that you are here. Today, we have the wonderful author. Christy is like jumping out of her skin already. Oh, and I just hit the wrong thing. Hang on a minute. I have your bio. Just give me a second because I just hit the wrong button on my computer.
Live direct recording. This is how it goes, guys.
This is how it goes, people. We are in live. All right. Maybe we'll cut that a little bit. Oh my goodness. We're so excited to have Ann Garrido with us today. I'm so nervous. Christy got me so nervous.
Sorry.
Because wait till you hear. Miss Ann Garrido is Associate Professor of Homiletics at Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis, Missouri, where she previously directed the school's Doctorate of Ministry in Preaching program, and has served as the Martin Faculty Fellow in Homiletics at the University of Notre Dame. She is the author of multiple books, including the award-winning Redeeming Administration, Redeeming Conflict, and Let's Talk About Truth. She travels nationally and internationally, helping communities talk about the topics they find toughest to talk about, conversations that always involve questions of truth. She lives with her husband in Miami, Florida. We are so glad that you're here. And let me tell you something. When Christy and I were talking about this season, we had all sorts of names come up, and Christy was like, you know who we need to talk about? No, she'll never do it. And she showed me these books and these great books, and she was just all excited. She's like, and I'm like, Christy, just ask her. You know, the worst thing that could happen is she actually says no, which probably not, because in church work, when we say no, we just ghost somebody. So you probably won't hear back. You know, and the best thing that can happen is she says yes. Well, let me tell you, I heard her scream for joy when she got your email back, and I am a state and a half away. So welcome, Ann. We're so glad that you're here today.
Oh, Lisa, trust me, the honor is all mine. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Well, I mean, so Ann, yeah, you've written several books, and it seems to me that you have a real penchant for leadership and how we work with each other relationally. And so I think that there's a whole lot of things that we want to talk to you today about, kind of unpacking those things with, particularly when things get difficult, because one of the things for me anyway, that I see a lot from new ministers is they think that because we're working in the church, everything's going to be, you know, pumpkin pie and whipped cream, and it's going to be beautiful and wonderful and lovely. And right, Sarah, how do you say it? We're going to sing Kumbaya and hold hands every day at work. Yeah. But so what do you think? What do you think some of the essentials for new ministers to be aware of whenever it comes to, well, no, actually, let's back it up. I want to talk about, like, when did you first start in a parish, and what was that like for you?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I got my start in parish work pretty darn young. It was actually my very first job when I was a freshman in high school. Okay. I was 14 years old, and I got invited to be the after-school receptionist at the parish rectory at that point in time. I belonged to my family. I grew up in a really large Catholic family and in a burgeoning parish at the time. I was the oldest of 8 kids, and we were kind of that family that would fill up the front row of the church on Sunday mornings. And I remember as a kid thinking, I think it was like the Feast of Pentecost, and we were listening to how the early disciples had been kind of afraid, and then the Spirit swept in, and then they all went out, and then they're, like you're saying, everybody lived in my imagination happily ever after. My dad was an accountant, and I thought, well, he would come home from work at the end of the day, and oftentimes, you know, he'd go like, my milk or my food is stuck right here. You know, like I just like, you know, he would come home and had a lot of difficult things that he had to deal with in the work. And I thought, when I grow up, I'm not going to go work in the business world. I'm going to go work in the church world because that's the place where people live happily ever after.
Yeah.
So I did. I got my first job at the parish when I was 14. I went after school and I would like stuff the bulletins, answer the phone, answer the door, that kind of stuff. And pretty early on, probably I was 15, and I realized, we had 4 priests at that time in our parish alone, which sounds crazy now, right?
Yeah.
But I very quickly recognized not all these priests think alike. And the sisters next door, like sometimes they might yell or lose their temper, or oftentimes I would see the gym gets double booked. And nobody thinks that the parish dishwasher belongs to them, to empty. And so it's like, what is going on? This is not quite like the Book of Acts. And then the climax of my early church career came when I was 17. It was on the night of Easter Vigil. And all of a sudden at the back door of the parish center, there was this doorbell ring, ding, 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 ding. And I ran down and one of our elderly parishioners was standing there and he goes, "The school's on fire." And one of the younger priests, I went over, opened the smoke billows out from the basement of the school. Really long story short, what had happened was a person on the maintenance team whose job was in danger of being lost because the building, there was some restructuring of the space within the school and so forth, had gotten upset about things and had lit a bucket of oily rags on fire in the basement of the school.
Oh my gosh.
And a really long story short, it did impact his job. He is no longer on that staff. That's right. I just remember thinking, I was standing there in the middle of like, people were trying to come into church, and then there's the fire department out front, and there was like, I remember thinking, we have come a really long way from the Book of Acts. And what had gone just so, and obviously that night it had gone dreadfully wrong. But I remember at that time just thinking like, wow, this is not at all what I had imagined that getting into ministry would be like. And I would throw this in there. It was some time before I began to understand a little bit more what went wrong, and then also what was going right in that situation as well. And maybe that's what we want to talk about, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How does one think about conflict that happens and tension that happens within parish staff?
Yes. So just a spoiler for our listener is that I have read your books and I'm a big fan. So I do. That's exactly why I recommend your work to others, is because you do talk about what is that benefit. So can you give us some of those immediate essentials for folks whenever it comes to conflict, either with colleagues or those we serve? Like how can we look at this in a more positive light, Ann, do you think?
Right. So I think the biggest essential for me, and the biggest shift that happened in my own mind, was I think when I was growing up, I thought that conflict always meant sin. Like someone is doing something wrong. And that's because if we were being the people we were supposed to be, everybody would be at peace all of the time. And there wouldn't be friction or tension. And that the only reason why there's friction or tension is that clearly there must be sin that's involved. Mm-hmm. That was what was the biggest shift for me as I got older. And I looked back at my early experience in ministry, was that I began to understand, what really got me into it was when I began to study the letters of St. Paul when I was a grad student. And I began to recognize, the letters of St. Paul were written even before the Book of Acts. And what we see is that, Jesus is barely burst forth from the tomb, and already there was already tension in the earliest Christian community around the role of women in the community, around how long should you stay somewhere in someone's house before you have to start earning your keep? Like who can come to the table, who can't? A lot of the things that we're still in tension about as Christians, they were dealing with even back then. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the church is continuing to go on. And that actually the research that's been done on parishes indicates that communities that report having no conflict, actually, if you scratch the surface, it's because it means they've died. So people only fight about things that they care about.
Yeah.
And communities in which there's no tension whatsoever, that tension in a congregation is actually the sign of passion. It's actually a sign of mission being alive, that people actually really care about this community and where we're going. Now, does sin enter into that conversation? For sure. And that's what ends up getting your school building, burnt down on Easter Vigil. Like, nobody wants to see that. So sin escalates tension. Sin creates bitterness within communities. But the fact that there is tension, or that we might disagree about, for example, what to do with the school building, how to structure a staff, who should be on staff or not, like those kinds of things, those are all related to the deep passion we have for wanting our community to thrive and to be the body of Christ in the world as best it can. And that actually the way that we handle those tensions is part of our Christian witness to the world. The world's not looking for us to be without tension whatsoever. What the world's really looking to us for is to say, could you be a community that has all the sorts of normal tensions that communities have, but show us how they're done well. So thinking at the very beginning, how do we begin to reframe conflict to look at it as part of the way that we're doing ministry, rather than the sign that ministry's gone awry?
Yeah.
Ooh.
How do we?
I'm writing like crazy here. This is insane. I'm already done my first page.
Good news, Lisa, we're recording.
I had a friend, Amy McEntee, shout out. She mentioned to me a while ago when I was going through a really rough time, and she just kind of like threw this out there as something that she remembers during a difficult time. She's a reader, she's an editor, she, loves to read. And she's like, stories always have conflict. The conflict is what moves the story forward. Right.
That's
and I wrote that down. I keep that in my journal because whenever we're in conflict, I'm like, okay, we are moving forward.
See, now I'm going to take pages of notes.
Conflict. Yeah.
Stories. Yeah. Yeah, they do, don't they?
Yeah. And we grow through them in really magical and wonderful ways. I love this. How we handle the tension is our Christian witness. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's absolutely beautiful.
Wow. And think of it as part of the drama of being alive. I love that.
Oh, trauma of being alive. It's not a boring life. Let's put it that way.
No.
Oh my gosh. Go ahead, Christy.
I was just going to say, is there a question in there, Sarah?
Well, I mean, there's I'm like, no, I just really wanted to say this, but I could probably come up with a question in there, like how do we shift our perspective to
that's
that?
The question,
Because sometimes the conflict is so overwhelming that it's tough to see the positive in there without being toxic positive. Because that toxic positivity can bring down the growth and the energy. So how do you shift your perspective to look at that conflict in a way that is or can be Christian witness, can be the passion of the ministry? How do you see that?
Yeah. I think, as we'll probably get into talking about more, I think a lot of it actually has to do with our own internal work. So some of conflict work is about developing some tools in one's toolbox, a set of questions that can be helpful, like when I get in a sticky situation. But a lot of it, I think, Lisa, as you're alluding to, has to do with a shift that has to happen in my own mind. And a lot of it is about a conversation that when it's sticky, I need to be having with myself. This is what in the world of kind of a conflict transformation, what we might call the identity conversation. So each of us have not only a vision of church, as we've been talking about already, but each of us have a vision of ourselves and who we want to show up as in the world. And one of the things not the only thing, but one of the hardest things for conflict is that each of us likes to think of ourselves as showing up in the world. You know, like I would say for myself, I want to show up as hardworking. I want to show up as on top of things. I want to show up as coherent and intelligent, you know, when I show up for a podcast. I want to, you know, like, and part of the challenge is that when things start to go a little bit askew, what it makes me begin to do is question not just the church, but question myself. So I begin to ask questions like, oh, maybe I'm not as competent as I like to think of myself as being, or maybe I'm not prepared for ministry in the way that I thought I was when I was going to get into this job. Maybe there's somebody better out there who knows what they're doing more than I do. Maybe, you know, and so what happens is this voice inside of our own head gets real loud. And so a lot of getting more comfortable or daring about getting into conflict and remaining in conflict is actually going to have to do with negotiating with that voice and helping it to be a little bit more my ally in the conversation rather than my nemesis, because it can get real loud and then it's really hard for me to talk to the other person at all because I'm having a conversation with myself. So allowing myself, like one of the things I might say to myself as an early tool, like what we're just talking about now, is to say, self, conflict is a normal part of the work environment and the family environment. And like I said, the drama of life. There's not necessarily, it doesn't mean someone's doing something wrong here. Your goal right now is to figure out what's going on. So like just some like things to be able to talk to myself. Self, you're going to be okay. You're hearing some hard things right now that maybe are coming as a shock to you, or they're not going the way that you had hoped they were going to be going. Shift your brain to begin to ask some questions and just see, you don't have to agree with what the other person's going to say. Just find out what they have to say before you begin to react. So like I have a couple of messages that I try to send to myself to calm down my own internal voice, make it a little bit quieter, so that then I can enter into the conversation more freely.
Oof.
Are there any specific things, Anne, that you think, I mean, I've given birth 2 times, and most of the time I say to myself, well, this isn't that, so I can do it. You know, because that, or like, and I can say because she's passed away, but my mother-in-law and I did not have a good relationship while she was alive. And I just would think like, this isn't 10 hours of labor. I can be with her for 3 hours and have lunch and act like a human being. You know what I mean? Just like, and I'm just using that as a dumb example, that not exactly the necessarily is the, when we're dealing with something that's really hard, like when we're getting hard feedback or someone is in conflict with us. I feel like in parish life, like you're wanting to do something differently. Everyone's yelling at you. We always have done it this way. And you're not seeing the value in why we've done it that way. And so there we would have tension. And sometimes like that can get nasty because I think people's feelings are getting hurt. Exactly like you're saying, like we're trampling on people's personal images of themselves. So like if I want to show up as a hard worker, but it doesn't seem like we're producing anything from this particular program or ministry, then maybe I'm not a hard worker. And that's, you know, anything that comes in and around that as feedback is going to feel like an attack.
Yeah. No, that's a great insight. One of the things, and there's a downside to this, but it is the message that I oftentimes will send to myself, is the first one I would say is, this is not about you.
Oof, yeah.
Now the challenge is sometimes with feedback conversations like you're talking about, sometimes it is about
you.
And I have to be able to, like, those are conversations that sometimes we need to be able to have too, in which case, another message that I have to send to myself in feedback conversations is, okay, so you're hearing some stuff about yourself that you don't really like right now. Maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't. But part of it is to be able to recognize, like, okay, so you're hearing that you're not showing up as hardworking, and yet you think of yourself as hardworking. Part of it is going to be that I want to try to know, first off, a message I send to myself is, you know what, I'm hardworking enough. None of us are, it's not like a black and white thing, like it's not an either or. I'm hardworking enough. She's giving me some clues about ways that I could show up as pulling my weight more. And I want to find out what those clues are. I want to find out how she's perceiving me, not because I'm necessarily thinking that's who I am, but because I'm curious to know there's a difference between my sense of self and the perception the other person has of me. And I'm interested in the space in between. And that's kind of linked also with what we were saying, like when I say it's not about me, there's something similar there too. And that this situation about, I don't know, I'm trying to come up with a scenario off of the top of my head. You know, it's like, and you know, like you're not, you know, let's just say you're not pulling your weight or whatever, and there's things that aren't getting done. If I begin to take myself out of the equation and begin to get curious, just in terms of like, what if I could shift to the perspective of, let's just say a newspaper reporter. And instead of getting into it, this person, I'm just going to try to find out what is the story they've got in their head. So I'm not like, if I could first find out, I want to try to ask some questions to elicit from this other person, what is their version of what's going on in the office? And what role do they see me playing in it, for example? Because I don't need, if I'm a newspaper reporter, I don't need to agree with their story. I'm just trying to get background information. Like I'm just trying to get the story. I can interview other people as well. But that helps me to go in, because if I'm a newspaper reporter, it helps me shift so that it's not about me, right? Newspaper reporters all the time get sent in to interview people about, you know, say political situations that they don't agree with. They don't have to take on the person's position. They're just trying to interview them to get the information that they need for the story, to put together the story. And if I can talk into my own internal voice a little bit and say, hey, shift roles here for a moment, get the story. You don't have to agree with it, but get the story. That sometimes helps get me in a better place to have a conversation.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think one of the things I want to say is it's a curious kind of a mindset, right? Like it's seeking out the questions. And sometimes what I see, I mean, the story I tell myself is that I'm a curious person, and I've kind of always been that way, but I don't think that it is a teachable, learnable skill. It's something like I grew up with, you know, I'm a Gen X kid. So like when I had a question about anything, we had that whole plethora of books that people call encyclopedias that you now use Google for, right? But, you know, my family would send me to a dictionary or to the encyclopedias to go look that stuff up. How do we kind of get it? How do we learn how to be curious? And thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, because it can be a developed skill set. It can be a developed skill set. So one of the things that can be helpful for me, at least, is to do a little bit of preparation in advance. Now, granted, all tough conversations don't come to you with an advance notice, right? Some of them spring themselves on your doorstep. But if you have the chance where you know you want to raise something and you're not quite sure how, or you just know that this could be kind of sticky if I go to talk to that person, I'll try to spend a little bit of time preparing to get into the conversation, because that helps me get more curious. And one of the things that I'll do is I'll give myself the gift of writing down on paper my own version of the story. Like I'll just do a dump of what is in my head about this. Not necessarily what I'm going to say out loud about it, but what's in my head about it, just to get a little bit more in touch with my own internal voice. But then after I do that, what I'll make myself do is to write down what I think is in the other person's head. Now, I don't know that for sure. This is a hypothetical, right? But I'll try to write that all down. And then I'll go through that and I'll just look at where there's lacuna in that story, like where there's hole in the story. And I'll just take a yellow highlighter and I'll just highlight that, because that's where I'm going to get the questions that I want to go into the interview with. So for example, when I'm writing it and I'm in the other person's head, I'm like, and then, you know, I'm stubborn because I'm not gonna give up on this. And then I'm like, you know what, Ann, in the other person's head, are they really saying the reason why I won't give in to what Ann wants is because I'm stubborn? The other person probably isn't thinking that way. You know, each person in their own head has their own best motives and they have good intentions at heart. And I'm trying to figure out what does the other person think they're doing? They're not saying I'm stubborn. They're saying, I'm fighting for what's right here. Why is he? And so then I begin to just write for myself, why is the other person doing what they're doing? Why do they think this is the best option? What might they be seeing that I'm not seeing? And those are the questions then that when I actually get into the conversation, if I don't have any questions yet, I know I'm not ready to go into the conversation. I want to have a couple questions in my mind that will help me to start.
Yeah.
I love
Sarah?
that. What are they seeing that I'm not seeing?
Yeah.
I love that, because we're all, we can be in the same space as someone else, but seeing it and understanding it differently.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. I love the meme of the two people looking at the 6 or the 9. To one of them, it's a 6. To the other one of them, it's a 9, and they're both right. And I think that's important too, because we can both be right, in air quotes, and we can both be wrong, in air quotes, and that I think is where the humility comes in to these kinds of conversations, and the vulnerability comes into these conversations, because it can be both and.
Yeah, in a lot of ways that is often the case. That most of the time what we're arguing about in the conversation is not the facts of the conversation. I mean, like, both of us agree that, this project didn't go well. What we disagree about is whose fault it is that it didn't go well. What were the mitigating factors, whether it matters that it didn't go well, whether there's something else that was going on at the same time that was more important than this, and that's why it didn't go well. So we're oftentimes not disagreeing on the facts. What we're disagreeing about is which facts matter, which facts are more relevant in this particular situation, and what we should do about the facts of the case. And so if I begin to reframe the conversation, okay, let's talk about what happened, not necessarily to figure out who was right or wrong, but just to figure out what happened and where do we want to go from here. One of my colleagues in Dominican life, I love this quote. He said, reality is like a bazillion volts of electricity. Most of us are working with about a 60-watt bulb in our brain. So what we've taken in, the facts that we've taken in comparison to the facts that we could take in any situation, it's pretty small. So I've got my facts about what went on. You've got your facts about what went on, but I probably have some data that you don't have, and you probably have some data that I don't have. And moreover, we're probably interpreting those data in pretty different ways from the positions in which we locate ourselves. And so, like, we don't need to actually, let's reframe the purpose of the conversation. Maybe it's not around figuring out who's right or wrong. It's like trying to figure out, why are we seeing this so differently?
Yeah, that's amazing.
And one of the things that frustrates me, and when I get frustrated, like seriously frustrated, I tend to cry. So I try not to get to this point. But when I get really frustrated, I think it comes down to the fact that I don't feel heard in those tough conversations. So how can I go into these tough conversations, or when I randomly find myself in a tough conversation that I didn't know I was going to get into, how can I be heard?
Yeah, so this is going to sound really tough in the sense that there are things that are escalate your chances of being able to be heard. But one of the things that you can't control in the conversation is the other person. So you can only control your own actions in the conversation, control the other person. And so I might really want the other person to hear me. I can't make them hear me. But so I'm going to just let go of that I have control over making you hear me. Yeah. But that being said, there are some things that I can escalate the chances of being heard. And one of the tricks of the trade that I might try in that situation is to keep it inside of myself. Like, it means a lot to me to know that what I've said has, like, I'm wondering if what I've meant to communicate has actually been communicated. And it would be really helpful to me could you summarize, let me summarize back to you what I've heard you say, and then could you summarize back to me what you've heard me say? Because that will help me to clarify, that will help me to know maybe what I've tried to communicate that hasn't come across.
Mm.
Or it would help me to know where I need to clarify a little bit further or add a little bit more, because I don't want to keep repeating myself to you. So just summarize what you've already heard.
Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Asking that as a favor of the other person, oftentimes is something they would be willing to do. And then you can find out what they have heard.
Mm. I'm writing this all down.
Yeah, I see that. He's like, there's like intensely like,
I'm like scribbling. You guys who are just listening, you can't see me. I'm like scribbling like crazy because, I think this is the thing that I struggle with the most is being heard or finding the language that the other person will understand or the tone that they will receive the best, the most openly. So this is where the tough conversations go for me.
Well, and I think, Lisa, that probably the other person a lot of times in their own story is, I've heard her. I don't know why she keeps repeating things over and over and over again. I've heard her, and I don't know why she thinks I haven't. But for each of us, there's clues that we pick up that indicate to us that we've been heard, and the other person's not giving you those clues. So for ourselves, maybe we might be somebody who would nod a lot, or maybe they would be able to summarize, or they'd be able to give some sort of like body feedback, like, oh, I'm with you, and they're not doing that. And so part of it is I might need to explicitly ask what it is that they've heard. The challenge is, I think sometimes we think that the only way that we've been heard is when the other person agrees with us or does what we want them to do.
Yeah.
And that's tricky because a lot of times I've seen people say, when younger people who are just getting into church ministry for the very first time, it's like, I need to be listened to. And I'll say, so what's the difference between being listened to and is that the same as being agreed with? Because that I might need to let go of. And I think that's the hardest thing to let go. It's possible I could be being listened to even if the other person isn't going to do what I want to do. But it also means people come to us too, right?
Yeah, they do.
Come to us too.
Yeah.
And that we have to be able to listen and give the indication that we've listened.
Right.
But how do we do that without agreeing? Because we're not going to be able to do everything people want us to do.
Yeah. And I often have said, I hear what you are saying. I hear what you are saying, and I leave it as a period. I don't necessarily say, but I don't agree with you, because then that just repeats the circle all over again, So we have blown past our time, but I really do want to hear from you. What do you wish you knew when you first started out in church ministry?
I think part of it is the part about being able to go to the conflict's not necessarily wrong. I wish I had known some skills for managing it better. Like I wish I had had a couple tools in my box when I got in. I wish I had known that people, no matter how old they are or how ordained they are, if you want to say, have feeling like they're still human beings.
Yeah.
And that being ordained doesn't give somebody secret skill sets that nobody else has. Like priests too can have their feelings hurt. Priests too can feel threatened. Priests too can have bad days and get upset. And nuns, like that. There's not this kind of hierarchy of things I had in my mind, like that we're all human. And I wish I'd understood that one of the greatest dangers for parish ministry is not necessarily conflict, but that the avoidance of it.
Yes. Yeah.
So one of the things we know a lot about cultures that are very kind, where kindness is valued as people's identity, And also, interestingly, in climates that are populated by a lot of women, I think this is a way that not because it's something that's gender specific, but it's a way that we've been socialized. It's actually to avoid having direct conversations that might be difficult. And because of that, we still have anger, we still have frustration. And so the greatest temptation I see functioning in parish life is that we go talk to each other instead of talking with the people who we're actually mad at. That's what creates Sarah, I think you mentioned the thing toxicity. Like that's what creates the toxicity, is that what actually happens is we don't have direct conversations. We go talk to other people and we blow off our steam there. And then I'm not as mad anymore because I've blown off my steam. But now what's happened is just my anger or frustration has spread through the whole system. One of the best lines that anybody ever gave me when I was pretty new in the field was, he said, "Ann, you want your anger to be like a coursing river and not a finely diffused mist."
Ooh.
Isn't that a great line?
Yes.
Wait, say that one more time.
You want your
And
anger.
you want your anger to be like a coursing river and not a finely diffused mist.
I'm going to have to ponder that one.
Except for that, Sarah, right beside me, I have a quote that you gave to me. You wrote it for me when we were cube mates. It says, "Anger brings clarity to what we believe."
Oh, nice.
Beth Nobby says,
Kenobi. Yeah, Beth Kenobi.
Beth Kenobi. Anger brings clarity to what we believe. And so I think that that's part of it. I think the other thing is, Anna, I recently, and I can't think of the person that said it, the recent bit of wisdom that I got was, venting is accomplishing nothing and avoiding your own responsibility in the situation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what my friend was hitting at. I can vent, and now the whole place is kind of breathing in my little, anger air particles, but we haven't actually solved the problem. And I think part of the reason why we get so nervous in getting into conversations is, one, my identity is I'm nice, and so I can't be a difficult person, right? So I don't want to do it. And then the other thing is, I think I'm afraid that if I get into the conversation, Christy, what you're illuminating is, I might find out something about myself and my own contribution to it that I don't want to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that makes me nervous.
Oh my gosh. This is such a great conversation. I'm so glad that you agreed to join us today. Christy, I'm so glad you went out on a limb and sent that email, because, and this is just such a great conversation. And I hope that we get a chance to come back to it again, because
there's so much.
There's so much to this. And I think we do need tools in our tool belt. And I'd love to hear some more of the tools that you've accumulated over the years, and, how we can build that up as ministry leaders. I think we're never too far into the ministry to be, learning something new and building that tool belt. So thank you for joining us today. Christy, hold up those books again. Ann Garrido, award-winning author of Redeeming Administration, Redeeming Conflict, and Let's Talk About Truth. And there is one more on the way, and we're looking forward to it. And maybe we'll have you on when that comes out, but maybe beforehand as well. So thank you, Ann. We look forward to what's next. Everyone, thanks for joining us today. Please click like and subscribe and share with your friends. Anybody who is in church ministry, especially those who are new to ministry and looking for tools for their tool belt. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye.